So a little bit of buzz going on. We've handed out some papers, and you're all trying to read them desperately to figure out what's going on. I'd just like for you to put them aside for a second, because we're going to get to them in just a few minutes, all right? So we're in this series called Life in the Neighborhood. Uh-oh, somebody took a tumble. That's okay. He'll be all right. So we started this series a few weeks ago called Life in the Neighborhood, and the whole intent behind this series was for me to do a little bit less talking and do some discussion as well in the service and talk about what it means to live our lives in the neighborhoods in which we find ourselves. We talked about what does God see and how do we live in relationship to that. We talked about cities and neighborhoods and communities. And last Sunday was from the book of Jonah, and there was a big, huge question right at the end of the message, which comes from God, and it's left unresolved, and I think it was meant to stay with us when we read it. And the question was, shouldn't I be concerned about a great city like this? And I think that question is still true for us in Bowmanville. Shouldn't God be concerned about this city? And it's our responsibility to figure out ways in which we can connect and communicate with our neighbors. Next Sunday, the message is already pre-recorded. I'll be on vacation, but it's going to continue and follow through in this series. And then the following Sunday, Leslie is going to be here, and she's going to be sharing the last in the series. Or actually, there's one more when I get back from vacation. I want to tell you a little bit about my experience in the neighborhood. When we lived in Michigan, we bought our first house, and I can't, just thinking about it today, we paid $80,000 for a 1,200 square foot house. Can you imagine? $80,000. That was like peanuts. I mean, people put that much down on a down payment, have to put that much down on a down payment nowadays. So we bought our first house, and we lived in this community for about 4 years as I was going to seminary and working part-time for a church. And we made a really strong commitment as a family to get to know our neighbors as best as we could. We had a garden, and every year our kids would pick things from the garden and hand them out to the neighbors. Our Hispanic friends across the street loved the jalapenos and the tomatoes, and other people enjoyed the zucchini, and so did we as a family. And we got to know the people as we moved in and amongst people in our neighborhood. And one of the families across the street from us is Larry and Mary. They were a bit older than us, and they had a daughter who had a child who was early premature, 24 weeks. And her and Dave and Larry and Mary, we got to know them, and we helped them fix their house, and I put boards on their deck, and we had a great big party in the backyard. And I thought to myself, that's what it means to be part of a neighborhood, to be close to your neighbors, to be connected. And there was opportunities for spiritual conversations. Dave and his wife, the daughter from Larry and Mary, they came to us and asked us to marry them. And then this child came premature, and everything went on the back burner. And we were there to walk with them through some of that. We visited them in the hospital. When we moved to Bowmanville, we made that same commitment. We said we want to make sure that we're connected with the people in our neighborhood. And over the years, some people have moved in and others have stayed, but we got to know Heinz and Sue across the street from us, who were the very first people to own a house in that whole subdivision where we live. They said there was nothing there when they built their house. And then Ashwin and June, who go to the Pentecostal church in town, foster parents extraordinaire. They take on the worst cases. And we've walked with them and babysat with them through some of those things. My neighbor Brad and his wife went through a crazy separation. And he came to me over and over again and said, I'm not interested in the religious stuff, but I need somebody to talk to. I need somebody to walk through this with. And then one night he texted me and says, Martin, would you pray for me? In one of the darkest places that he was in. A little while ago, probably about a month and a half ago, I was out for a walk in the neighborhood. I came back, and there's an ambulance at the end of the street at the house of Heather and Jamie. Jamie and I have this interesting connection. He and I are the same age. We were born on the same day. We were born in the same city and in the same hospital. What are the odds of that? And I'd never met him before until we moved to Bowmanville. Incredible, like this really strange connection. But we got to know them through our daughter, Jana. And the ambulance was out in front of his house, and I stood out there waiting while the paramedics were inside, and they brought Jamie out. He got put into the ambulance, and off they went. And I said to myself, okay, I got to go. And I'm walking back to the house, and I said, I should go to the hospital and visit Jamie. And I realized at that moment that I didn't know Jamie's last name. I can't go to the hospital and say, hey, I'd like to visit my neighbor. The lady's going to look at me and go, well, who is your neighbor? And I'd be like, well, he's Jamie. He lives over on that street. Sorry, that's not good enough. But it's a good question. Who is your neighbor? The whole idea behind this series is to take seriously the idea that you and I have an influence in the neighborhoods, in the places that we work, in the apartments we live in the networks of people. And fundamental to that component is how well do you know the people that you work with, live with, spend time with on the baseball field. You see, it's that long-term, sustained connection that you keep at. 4 years it took for that family in Michigan, Larry and Mary, to come to a point where they felt comfortable enough to have a conversation about spiritual things. My Brad, neighbor, I've known him for 6 years that he's lived there. It's in those moments when life happens, significant events, marriages, deaths, funerals, crisis, that someone then connects the dots and says, oh yeah, they're a spiritual person. They have a connection with God. I need to find them and have a conversation. Jesus spoke about this most significantly in probably the most famous parable that he ever taught about, which was the Good Samaritan. Laws have been enacted in our society, Good Samaritan laws, based upon this parable that Jesus taught. But it all starts with someone asking a very fundamental question. And the question begins as we read from the scriptures in Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse 25. I'm going to put that up on the screen for us. One day, an expert in the religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? This was an expert in the law. Pay attention here. This is not a, gee, I have a question, Jesus. This is a, I'm going to try and trip you up, Jesus question, right? He's an expert in the religious law. Jesus replied, what does the law of Moses say and how do you read it? Great answer. Ask another question. I love it. And the man says this, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him, do this and you will live. See, the man wanted to justify his actions. And so this response from the religious leader is probably one of the most significant passages in the New Testament. We call it the Great Command. It's so important that we've given it a name, like the Great Commission. The Great Command, if you will go back to it, please, just back a verse. One more. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind. And this is probably, it is the most fundamental piece of our Christian faith. Because when we have a vertical relationship with God, when we put all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind and our strength, my heart is my passions and my feelings and my ideas about things is where my mind comes into it, and how I think and what I believe about stuff comes into my mind. And then all of our soul and our strength, all of our soul, what is it that my significance of my being, all of that, even my strength, is given to God in whatever I do. And when that vertical relationship is right, then we have this horizontal relationship with and love your neighbor as yourself. I was thinking about the all your strength part of this verse. And I just finished watching on Netflix Hacksaw Ridge. Any of you seen this movie? Very profound, spiritually very profound. Extremely gory and detailed. Not recommended for children. It's R-rated. It's a war movie, okay? But Desmond Dawes, a conscientious objector, believes that God has called him to go to battle and not pick up a rifle, but to be a medic. And the scene unfolds, a little bit of a spoiler alert. Sorry if you haven't seen it. I'm going to spoil it a little bit for you. He's up on the ridge, and he goes back as a medic to rescue as many people as he can. And he keeps repeating this phrase over and over and over again. Lord, just give me one more. Lord, just give me one more. And you can see his strength fading after each carry to rescue someone. All of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. When you have that vertical relationship with God, you cannot help but be thinking about him in all of your ways. All that you do should be evident to you when you give that much passion and energy to something. And then the religious leader says, but, and, at the very bottom, and, next slide, please. Love your neighbor to yourself. It's so important to recognize that out of this vertical relationship with God, our lives must be lived in a horizontal way. We can spend all the time in a world in our relationship with God, and that's important, especially on Sunday and every day when you think about Him and all that you do. But unless we live it horizontally, no one will know the glory of God. Because most people will never pick up a Bible or walk through the doors of the church. They will see God's glory in you when you love your neighbor as you love yourself. And then the religious man wants to justify his actions, and he says this in verse 29. And who is my neighbor? I mean, certainly it can't be the Gentiles, right, Jesus? It couldn't be people that, are unclean spiritually, ceremonially unclean. We as Levites and teachers of the law are not supposed to fraternize with people like that. Certainly it can't be people who disagree with us, right? Politically, maybe on the left and we're on the right, and we spend all our time focusing on how to fight back against what the left is doing. Certainly it can't be that. It can't be people that we disagree with. Certainly, God, they're not a neighbor. How about ethnically? We have nothing in common with those people. Certainly, they can't be our neighbor. All of these pregnant pauses and fill in the blank spaces are what this question is asking. Who is my neighbor? He was trying to find a way to get out from under the whole thing and decide, where are the safe things? Who are the safe people that I can serve and love? And then Jesus tells the parable. Jesus replied with a story, verse 30. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits, and they stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed onto the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Samaritan. We lose the punch of this story because we don't understand Samaritans. The Samaritans were half-breeds. They were people who were part Assyrian and part Jew, and the people of Israel hated them. You don't even associate with a Samaritan. It's worse for you to hang out with a Samaritan than it is for you to be seen alone with a woman. I mean, that's how bad it was, right? That's the kind of culture that they lived in. You don't hang around with, certainly a Samaritan isn't my neighbor. And this is who Jesus uses as the center point of his story, because he goes on and says, then a despised Samaritan came. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. And then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If the bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. And then Jesus responds this way. I love this answer because it's not who is my neighbor. The question then becomes, now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Jesus flips it over on its head. Did you see that? Who is my neighbor, the man says. Jesus says, the wrong question. Are you the neighbor that your neighbor is looking for? Are you the compassionate one? Because the answer here is this. The man replied, the one who showed mercy on him. Yes, now and go do the same. He never answers the question, who is my neighbor? Instead, he forces the man to ask the question, am I a good neighbor? Am I the one that is looking out for my brother, my sister? Am I the one who's asking the question, do unto others as they would have them do unto me? Who is your neighbor? Well, Larry and Mary came to me one morning back in Michigan. They were the ones across the street with this little one. You see, their child who was born, their grandchild who was born so premature at 24 weeks, had a tracheotomy. And over the course of those 4 years, we'd got to know them, we'd spent time with them, we'd partied with them, we'd had a great relationship, almost married their kids. And I saw Mary across the street one morning with tears coming down her eyes. And I said to AJ, there's something wrong with Mary. I better go find out what it is. And then Mary tells me that this little one had pulled the tracheotomy out and died. He was scheduled just 1 week away from having it surgically removed. And she said to me, we don't know anyone else who could do this, but would you do the funeral? And I said to her, of course, Mary. I'd never done a funeral before. Never done a funeral, let alone do it for a child. This little one, 24 weeks old, who was born so early that we cared for and watched grow to about 1.5 years. And I said, of course, Mary. And so I scrambled. I went to the funeral home. I talked to the funeral director. I said, I've never done one before. He said, you got to help me. And so they walked us through the process, and there were so many people that attended this funeral that they set up a tent outside. The hospital nurses and doctors had come because they had cared for this child. People in our community heard about the tragedy, and the funeral home didn't even accept any money to pay for this child's funeral. Who is your neighbor? It's a good question. I think the question really should be, am I willing to be a neighbor? One who has compassion and mercy. So what I want you to do is I want you to get into groups of 8. Right where you are. If there's more than 8 of you, find another group, please. I'd rather they be 6 in a group than 8. Okay? And I want you to take this sheet that I've given you. And what I want you to do is this. I want you to put yourself in the middle here, in the center square. And then take a few minutes and answer the questions that are listed there. Start filling in as much as you can about each of your neighbors around you. That's the first part. The questions on the bottom are for when you get together in your group. So there's an individual portion. Write down what you know about your neighbors. Now, some of you are living in apartment buildings. Well, then write down who else is in the apartment buildings. If some of you are living in rural areas and their neighbors are a mile away, that's okay. Write them down. As a matter of fact, I heard from some people living rurally, especially Terry and Debbie, that you probably know the people who live a mile away from you in the rural areas better than city people do. Who are your neighbors? Write them down. Yeah, Oliver. That's right, literal neighbors. So here's the fun part of this. Some of you have just moved and you think, well, I just got there, I don't know anybody. Perfect. You don't know anybody. Write down what you do know and tell me what you've observed about those neighbors so far. The assignment is to get us to a place where we start asking the question, how do I get to know those neighbors? All right? So go ahead. You got to do the exercise individually. There are, the ushers have some pens. There are some in the seat pockets in front of you. If you need a pen, just put up your hand and the ushers AJ will come around and give you a paper. All right? So we've got about 7 minutes to do this on your own, and then I'm going to ask you to get into your groups. Hey, everyone, let's get into groups now. So you grab your chairs and move them around. Turn around maybe where you are. Groups of 6 to 8, please. All right, so we have about 2 minutes left. If you're not all the way around the circle getting everybody's information, just ask you to hurry up in the process. About 2 minutes to go. All right. We've come to the end of our time for discussion. You don't have to move anything around specifically. What we're going to do is we're going to end the service time here and then sing a song together. You can just stand where you are and we can do that. But before we do that, I just wanted to say that it's been our hope throughout this series, and I've said this every Sunday, that you would feel that God might be moving in some way or prompting you in some way, that possibly even you could partner with someone else in your group to do something that God is prompting. All throughout this series, it's been our hope to say, God needs to be at work through us as a church. And when God is at work through the church, there's no other word for it except glorious. When God is at work in and through the church, it is glorious. That was what Jesus intended, that the church be a place where God's people get inspired and understand the call of God to be obedient and to live out this life of faith. And it comes down to that fundamental question, who is my neighbor? And love your neighbor as yourself.